This video lecture is on the American philosophical tradition known as Pragmatism, but I will focus on the philosophy of William James from his book, Pragmatism, A New Name for Some Old Ways of Thinking, which was actually a publication taken from two sets of lecture series. William James is not only famous for being a philosopher and promoting the philosophy of pragmatism, but he also was the founder of modern psychology. So he is very famous in many different fields, and especially in psychology. There's this big award named after him. Now, pragmatism was not started by James. He says he was influenced by the American Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce took a more Kantian approach to pragmatism, is where James is more influenced by Hume and like John Stuart Mill and so on, more empirical a bit of a approach. But there are other famous pragmatist philosophers from this first wave of pragmatism, like John Dewey, for example. And then you get later what are called neo-pragmatists later on, so this would be someone like Richard Rorty. But pragmatism is fascinating because, in a way, it seeks to sidestep or put aside a traditional dichotomy between like rationalism and empiricism. It seeks to deny the aim traditionally in philosophy for some conception of truth which is transcendental, right? It's like preserved, that it's given, it's objective, and holds for all time, all people, and so on, right? It's like external in a way to the human mind. So pragmatism, in a way, is a radical philosophy, which might actually go against the name pragmatism, right? To be pragmatic. We'll discuss that towards the end of the video lecture. But what I want to begin with is this supposed problem that James mentions in the second lecture from this book. And he mentions that one time he was out camping. I can't remember exactly where, maybe it's in New Hampshire or something like that. And he's with a group of friends, and James decides to go off on a little walk, by himself. And when he comes back to the camp with his friends, he finds that there was a big debate that broke out. And his friends had kind of put themselves into two opposing camps, and they were equal camps. So James, depending on which person he sided with, right, would prove to be the decider as to which one, would be said to be correct. So what was the dispute? Well, he says this was a metaphysical dispute about the question as to whether the man goes around the squirrel or not. So apparently, one person saw a squirrel on a tree, and they tried to run around, right, the tree to get sight of the squirrel. But the thing is, every time the person went around the tree, right, the squirrel maintained an equal, right, opposition from the person, such that they were always perfectly on the other side of the tree as they went around, such that the man never saw sight of the squirrel. So the question is then, even though the person ran around and round and around the tree, and even though the squirrel is going around and round and around the tree, did the man go around the squirrel or not? It seems like a weird question, right? But it would seem to say, like, well, no, it's like a fact. Either the man did go, right? So it's just objectively true that either the man did go around the squirrel or the man did not go around the squirrel, right? So regardless as to how silly this dispute seems to be, there still would be, at least which is presupposed by the people, right, a necessary answer to this, which is the truth, right, of the situation, which corresponds somehow to the real world. Now, James comes in and he does not satisfy either camp, actually. They think that he was maybe being disingenuous in his answer, that James really just was kind of messing with them. But here's what James says. And the importance of this is that he's going to show you what he calls the pragmatic method here in this. James says, look, which party is right depends on what you practically mean by going round the squirrel. Right? So whether it is true the man went round the squirrel, chasing the squirrel around the tree, or whether it's true that the man did not go around the squirrel, it depends on not simply what is meant by going round, but what is practically meant, right? And throughout this lecture, we'll try to discern, what exactly that means. Now he says, if you mean passing from the north of him, so if we have from the north to the east, then to the south, then to the west, right? So if the squirrel's here, north, east, south, west, and then to the north of him again, James says, obviously the man does go round him, for he occupies successive positions. But if, on the contrary, you mean being first in front of him, then behind him, then on his left, and finally in front again, it is quite as obvious that the man fails to go round him, right? Because what he's saying is, if you mean that the squirrel, in a way, the man such is able to see the back side of the squirrel, the front side, then the other side, and then the back side of the squirrel again, then in that way, right, they go around all the successive points of the body of the squirrel. Now, of course, that didn't happen because the squirrel always, in going around the side of the tree, always kept their belly, if the tree was not there, facing towards the person running around the tree. And he says, so it is quite as obvious then, if that's what we mean, that the man fails to go around him, for by the compensating movements the squirrel makes, he keeps his belly turned towards the man all the time, and his back turned away. Make the distinction, and there is no occasion for any farther dispute. You are both right and both wrong, according as you conceive the verb to go round in one practical fashion or the other. Now, again, you might see then why he's saying, like, look, it just depends on whatever you mean by this. So in a way, according to this one, way in which we would mean to go round, this camp is right. And according to this other way in which we would mean go round, the other camp is right. And James doesn't say which one is right then, because there is no, objectively right answer. He's saying, what do you mean? So one way we can think about it is, when we think about to go around, how do we use this in normal everyday life? Now, if I were to say, look, I went round, that tree, but in going around that tree, I occupied all the successive points around the tree. Maybe, right, that might be correct, but we would ask why? Why would that be correct? Does it lead us anywhere? Does it, give us something that has cash value, as James would say, that we can make use of, as we'll see. And, of course, there is no practical difference as to this conflict, because it doesn't change our lives as to whether or not the man went around the squirrel or not. Now, as we'll see, if there was some practical consequence, something that actually affected our lives as to what we mean by go around the squirrel or not, then that would be able to decide as to whether or not the man went around the squirrel or not. So James, right there in this case, introduced the pragmatic method. He says, the pragmatic method is primarily a method of settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might not be interminable, right? There might not seem to be a clear answer. And in a way, you could think this is like Sextus Empiricus when he says, you have these two competing claims, and you're not sure which one is true. They both seem to, have good weight to them. Now, the method is meant to settle the disputes. He says, if no practical difference whatever can be traced between these two opposing arguments, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle, because there's no point if there's no practical difference. There's nothing we could use. Like, if it were true that we said the man went around the squirrel, and this somehow allowed us to, I don't know, circumnavigate the world or something like that, right? That would have a practical difference. And in one way we could say, if it allows us to circumnavigate the world, well then perhaps it was true the man went round the squirrel or not, right? But if there is no practical difference, it doesn't allow us to actually do anything in the world, he says, then your dispute is actually meaningless because you're not arguing over anything that has any real difference. So he says, whenever a dispute is serious, we ought to be able to show some practical difference that must follow from one side or the other's being right. So we might look at one case, okay? Vaccines. Do vaccines work or not? Now, he would say, well, is there a practical difference? Is there some difference that could follow from one side's being right or not? And we have evidence because we could look at when we give vaccines for, let's say, smallpox, smallpox goes away. When we don't do that, smallpox remains prevalent. So there would then seem to be a practical difference as to whether or not vaccines fight against viruses or not. Now, of course, this gets into more serious philosophical matters we'll see in a moment, but the point is, though, that when he puts forward what he calls the pragmatic method, that he's saying pragmatism is not some school that's like it's not an ideology, right, that tries to give you this picture of the world and how the world truly is. He's saying it's a method, that it's not a final answer, that it's not a general theory of how things are. He says pragmatism appears less as a solution, then, as a program for more work, and particularly as an indication of the ways in which existing realities may be changed. Because pragmatism, since it is a method here, actually means when we try to settle disputes and we say, oh, well, this one seems to be more useful in that there's a practical difference, right? And as to then whether or not that difference we would say is positive or negative, that would involve, we'll see a bit later, we would be able to discern that difference, which one we would desire. But the point is that when we say that, that actually leads to then more questions and more things to improve our lives, right? That pragmatism is something active. It's not something that is final. It's not something static, as we'll see. So truth then, in the pragmatist sense, he says, means that ideas, which themselves are but parts of our experience, right? So this is his empiricist background, that our ideas become true insofar as they help us to get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience. So truth in our ideas means their power to work. Now, we might think of one example that could be as to whether or not we have an idea that God is someone that intervenes in our lives and improves our lives, right? If we pray to God or so on and so forth, right? Now, here's the interesting thing we'll see. For James, whether or not, right, we have that idea that God has divine intervention and God can then improve our lives or make our lives worse, we would want to ask, okay, is that idea true? Now, the first thing we would have to do is actually confront then the idea then that this immaterial being has the power to basically, right, it's supernatural, to change the natural world. We would have to combat that with our other ideas that there is a natural world such that science shows us, right? There's some seeming regularity to the world such that no one who is dead comes back to life, right? Now, once we do that, we might say, okay, which one is more useful in our lives? And we might say, well, that thing, that there is a natural world where bodies don't just come back to life, that, there's a cause for things that we can, that produces effects, right? we might say, well, that seems to be more useful because this allows us to improve technology. This gives us things like computers. This allows us to create vaccines. This allows us to use technology to harness the energy from the sun to create power to then, power our laptops or give us light and artificial light and things like that. We might say, well, this seems to be more useful, and in this way, then, there might seem to be more weight to that idea than to the idea of God as being something supernatural. Now, on the other hand, and this is where James is very interesting as a philosopher here, and I will come back to this at the end of this lecture. James would also say, and yet, the belief that there is a God, if it makes this person have a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, that it makes them happier, that it grounds them to their family, maybe to their community, that even though this might seem to be contradictory, and it is contradictory to the other ideas that science would tell us about the world, nonetheless, though that idea, if it produces those effects, are useful, and in that way they are also true. So there's a sense then in James where actually you can have competing claims that you can hold, and that's okay, as long as in holding those competing claims, right, that it's more useful to your life. Now, if it's less useful and you're not able to get the work done you might otherwise want to do, if your life seems to be less meaningful and so on, then those ideas wouldn't be true because they don't lead to some practical difference in your life that's meaningful. Or I should say, there is a practical difference, and actually it is less meaningful, right? So then it would be false. So let's let's look at this a bit more closer. What exactly then does James mean by truth? What does it mean for an idea to be true then? Now, he says that the popular notion in philosophy is that, and among science as well, actually, is that truth must be a copy of reality, right? So that, and this is known as the correspondence theory of truth, that when we have an idea, it is true if it is an exact mirroring of what the world is externally of the mind. Right? So my idea is only true if it corresponds to the external world. So truth is really independent of the human mind and what we believe, right? We just want to know, do our beliefs map onto the world as it really is or not? And he says, so we have these different camps. First, we'll look at the idealists. Now, he says some idealists say that ideas are true whenever they are what God means that we ought to think about that object. And in this way, he's thinking of someone like Descartes, for example, and or even other maybe more religious scholars, maybe someone like St. Thomas Aquinas or even St. Augustine, right? That basically God has constructed our minds such that he is guaranteed that when we conceive something as true, it really is true because God has determined, right, that we view the world in that way. Now, other idealists, he says, say ideas are true if they are a copy of the absolute's eternal way of thinking, that they correspond to some universal sense of reason where really we don't need the empirical world. We can just comprehend by the nature of our own minds as to whether or not our ideas are true. And typically someone proceeds, right, deductively in this manner. And this could be someone like Baruch Spinoza, for example. But you also have empiricists, which actually come just before James. So James didn't have time to respond to the logical positivists. He actually sees rationalism as the main enemy of pragmatism. But later on, logical positivists come to be an even more formidable opponent to pragmatism. And so you have people like Dewey that would respond against the logical positivists. But with the logical positivist correspondence theory of truth, They hold that our ideas are true insofar as they copy the thing as it independently exists in reality. So again, that our idea is true only if, right, there is some external world that, like, regardless of whatever we think about it, it truly exists, and we either understand the language of the world or we do not. And so we can see with this little picture here I have on the PowerPoint that according to the correspondence theory of truth, the one person on the left has this idea that there's like an apple or a red ball, I'm not quite sure what that is, inside of a box, right? And that's not in the basket. And it turns out their idea is true because regardless of actually whatever the person thinks or knows about the box and the basket, that the red apple or red ball really is in the box. Correspondence theory of truth would say their idea is false if they think the red apple or ball is in the basket, but in reality, regardless of whatever they think, even if they know anything about it or not, that externally independent of the mind, the red apple or red ball, right, is actually in the box and not in the basket. And so their idea does not correspond to reality as it is. Now, James thinks the correspondence theory of truth is wrong. James's theory of truth is mind dependent. But it's not mind dependent in the sense of which the rationalists think. Because for the rationalists, right, what is true really is a product of reason and not like material objects in the world. And in that way, right, they again hold the correspondence theory of truth because it either always has been or it has not been, regardless of actually whatever we believe. For James, truth is a means, remember? It's not an end. He says, traditional philosophy would have it that truth or knowledge is static. That once something is known, it is grasped, it is possessed. It's a a kind of destination has been reached, so to speak. Or, in essence, that when something is known, nothing need more need to follow because epistemologically you are in stable equilibrium, right? That you have the truth, and there you go, right? It's true in and of itself. Now, for James, nothing can be true in and of itself. Truth is always a means. It is always a means to some end, and this is why, for James, truth is something which is mind dependent. But it is not mind dependent in that the mind is built such in a way that it recognizes necessary eternal truths, something that like Immanuel Kant might argue. So he says, actually, pragmatism agrees that ideas are true insofar as they agree with reality. But again, right, it's that word agree which matters. We want to know, is there a practical difference then between agreement in the sense of the correspondence theory of truth proponents or what James is putting forth? So what is meant by agreement, and then what is meant by reality? So he says, consider, if we were in a classroom, right, there'd probably be a clock on the wall. So I would use that as a demonstration. We don't really have this here. I don't have a clock in front of me. But consider there's a clock on the wall. You have an idea that this is a clock, right? So your idea represents that is a clock. Now, he would ask, do you know the clock's inner workings? Do you know every single detail of every single thing inside the clock and what makes it possible for it to be a clock? Now, I highly doubt it, and James doubted it as well, that you would be some master clockmaker, that you could explain why the way the clock functions inside there means it must necessarily be a clock. The fact is, we don't have to know the workings of a clock to know that is a clock, that our idea is true that is a clock, what we're looking at. He says, your idea of its works, right, the internal things of the clock, unless you're a clockmaker, is much less of a copy, right? Because your idea that that's a clock, if you're not a master clock maker, you're not going to have an exact, your idea of it that this is a clock is not going to be an exact replica of that thing as it exists in reality. Yet, he says, it passes muster, for it in no way clashes with reality. Even though it should shrink to the mere word works, now he's saying that your idea works, not the works inside the clock, that word still serves you truly. And when you speak of the timekeeping function of the clock, or of its spring's elasticity, it is hard to see exactly what your ideas can copy, because you're not a master clockmaker. So how could you know as to whether or not, right, the springs need a certain elasticity in them for it to work and for it to function as a clock? The fact of the matter is, we test every single day whether or not a clock works. Now, if we were in a classroom, right, our class would end at a certain time. And one way we would know as to whether or not, right, is so if we managed our time around that clock on the wall, right, so we had this idea that that is a clock. If we got out of class and we noticed, wait a second, like, other people are still in class, they're not in the hallways, nobody's going to other classes, that's weird, right? We might start to doubt, well, maybe either that clock doesn't work or it's not a clock at all. Maybe it could be, you know, some kind of a gag or something like that, right? If reliably every single day, when let's say our class would end at 3 p.m., right? 3 p.m. hits, we go out the door, and we see other people in the hallways as well, leaving classes and then going to other classes and so on. The idea that that is a clock, and such then we managed our life around the idea that that is a clock, that is useful. It works. It leads us to other fruitful experiences in our lives. And if it did not work, such that we tried to use the clock, and when we left class, it turns out other people were still in class, or like it was the wrong time, we had met before class was supposed to start, that wouldn't really function as a clock because it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Or at least what our idea of it as a clock is, which is a timekeeping function. That means, for James, whether or not something is true does not depend on whether or not the idea of it that you have of it corresponds exactly, independent of the mind as to how it actually exists in the world. As to whether your idea is true or not depends as to whether or not it is useful for you. And in this way, then, we can see why it is mind-dependent. Because that means truth is not static. You might have a certain idea that, let's say, smoking cigarettes is beneficial. That was an idea people had at one point in time. It seemed to be useful. It was a common thing people did. You would prescribe it. Doctors would prescribe it. Eventually, that idea came face to face with other experiences where people were less healthy. And that idea then that smoking cigarettes was healthy was not useful to our lives because we found out actually our health deteriorated. Such then that truth can change. Truth is like plastic, James says. Now this might be something difficult to think, right? But he says, look, science does not proceed, in building something that is true for all time. It proceeds by changing, right? As to, for example, let's take Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics would have said that time is not relative. It's universal. What happened? Well, it turns out it doesn't exactly hold for larger distances, such that Einstein shows with the theory of relativity that actually time is relative. Or quantum mechanics, right? Quantum physics says different things about the world than what Newtonian physics would say, right? So in a much smaller scale, reality would then seem to work differently. And James would say, now that the idea that reality works differently on a smaller scale is only true because it's useful. It allows us to maybe do other things, to build new technologies that improve our lives in ways that we agree with. So truth, then, we should understand, is an affair, it's an affair of leading. That truth is a process. That our ideas are true, we verify every single moment of our existence because we test our ideas, such that truth is a process of verifying ideas by leading us from one area of our life to another. And if our idea doesn't lead us to another area of our life that we would want, then that idea is false. So again, with that idea of the clock on the wall, we every day indirectly verify that our idea that this is a clock because it leads us onto other tasks. And he says, just as we here assume Japan to exist without ever having been there, because it works to do so, so everything we know conspiring with the belief and nothing interfering, so we assume that thing to be a clock. We use it as a clock, regulating the length of our lecture by it, in the same way that we would use the idea of Japan as a country with its own, history and culture and so on, right? That this corresponds usefully to other ideas we have about the world, and then how we, construct our life around that idea of Japan and so on. Just like we do with the clock, and just like the function of what a clock is supposed to do. And this idea that truth, that an idea is true insofar as it leads us, fruitfully in this way, right? It's we're talking about truth pragmatically. He gives this example of, let's say, if we were lost, and he says the possession of truth, so far from being here an end in itself, is only a preliminary means toward other vital satisfactions. If I am lost in the woods and starved, and find what looks like a cow path, it is of the utmost importance that I should think of a human habitation at the end of it, for if I do so and follow it, I save myself. The true thought is useful here, because the house which is its object is useful. The practical value of true ideas is thus primarily derived from the practical importance of their objects to us. So, let's say we're lost out in the woods, and we have an idea of what a cow path is, and that, this would mean cows regularly follow a path because humans, move them from one place to another, right? So meaning there would be a farm that likely then, if cow paths are associated with human habitation, that if we follow this path and it leads us to a house in which a human lives and then which can save us if we're lost in the woods, right? I can test that idea. And if I follow what I take to be a cow path, and it leads me then to a human habitation such that I'm saved, right, that I'm no longer lost, then my idea would be true because I verified it. It led me somewhere fruitful in my life to a human habitation, right? Now, if that didn't happen, then maybe my idea either of what a cow path is or that what is in front of me is a cow path would be false. So we can come to a solidified definition of the concept of truth for James's pragmatism, and we can say truth is that which works. That an idea agrees with reality does not mean it is like pieces of a puzzle fitting together, right, with the correspondence theory of truth, but he says it's like roads joining together up at certain places and roads that just join at others. That what matters is whether or not their functions are able to be performed. So they lead, our ideas, if they're true, lead away from eccentricity and isolation from foiled and barren thinking. The untrammeled flowing of the leading process, its general freedom from clash and contradiction, passes for its indirect verification. But all roads lead to Rome, and in the end and eventually, all true processes must lead to the face of directly verifying sensible experiences somewhere which somebody's ideas have copied. So truth, if an idea is true, if it works, what does it mean for it to work? It means it leads us fruitfully to areas of our life, right, that allow us then in other areas of our life to continue doing that and improving it. And if at some point in time it no longer does that, then that idea no longer works and it's no longer true. And this is why for James, truth is something plastic. Truth is not static. It's malleable. But this doesn't mean truth is just something of, just because I want to believe it, it can be true. Because my experience can determine whether or not it's true, if it works or not. Now, in this way, I think we can see pragmatism as a kind of middle path taken between two extremes. James actually begins his lectures on pragmatism by saying there's this kind of antagonism in philosophy between the rationalists and empiricists. And he says the rationalists are kind of the tender-minded, that they are your devotee to abstract and eternal principles. And in this way, he thinks people flock to rationalism because this gives us something solid. It gives us this idea of hope of a universe which is meaningful. On the other hand, we have empiricists. He thinks these are the more tough-minded, kind of crude people. These are your lover of facts in all their crude variety, right? And sometimes they might say, well, facts no matter what, even if it goes against your hopes and dreams or something like that, right? And James wants to say, look, in a way we can have our cake and eat it too. Now, he's going to err more on the side of the empiricists, but he nonetheless thinks the empiricists are wrong in their insistence on truth, right? Being able to link externally, right? That truth is something mind independent. Now he says, what you want is a philosophy that will not only exercise your powers of intellectual abstraction, but that will make some positive connection with this actual world of finite human lives. And in this way, he sees pragmatism as being something which can perform that function of relating deeply to the human experience and not being... so that picture I have in the PowerPoint, right? Where you have the pragmatist that says, look, it's a shadow over here, I'm looking at the ground. And the visionary, which is looking up at the sky, right, of what might be. That conception in that picture, which is why I have it on this PowerPoint, is wrong. Because James wants to say, we can actually change what is true. We can bend, push on the limits of truth. We can do this by maybe saying our belief in God can be true because it gives me meaning in my life. And yet we can also say that science is true when it says there is no God. That in this way, you can be maybe a visionary about what is possible, and yet you can also be a pragmatist or an empiricist where you go out and you actually test these things and see whether or not, it leads you somewhere fruitful in your life or not. So think of pragmatism then as a kind of middle path between these two extremes in philosophy. In terms of a discussion question, what I'd like you to do is actually critique, interrogate the pragmatist conception of truth and what it means for an idea to be true. And I want you to do this in light of the Theaetetus. So what might Socrates and Theaetetus conclude if they had taken up the pragmatist conception of truth? If an idea leads to a fruitful consequence, could that meet the criteria of knowledge? And what do you think?